dear friend Liz Beaven, but I'd like to, but I won't. But I will say that it's been a huge pleasure to have her here. She's been in Arizona for a week, and unfortunately has not been able to visit all the schools, but she's committed to coming back. So she'll come another week, another time, and be able to visit those who she hasn't yet visited. But this week of her visiting, I'm sure she'll tell you about that, but it's just a breath of fresh air to have someone like Liz be able to come and see all of our schools and visit the children and visit the teachers and the administrators and be really part. I mean, I have felt that you're part of our community. That's how I've felt. And I've been able to spend quite a bit of time with her, so it's a huge pleasure. Liz Beaven is the executive director of the Alliance for Public Waldorf Education. And before that, and I'm sure I'll miss a whole lot because she's so accomplished, but she has been the president of Rudolph Steiner College. She's been the administrator for how many years? 11 years at Sacramento Waldorf School, and you taught there for like 10.
Mm-hmm.
So she has been around. She has been an administrator, she's been a teacher, a parent, and most of all, in my experience, just a beloved colleague. I am so grateful to have her here. It's a privilege. So thank you, Liz, so much for being here.
Thank you, Jo.
We welcome you.
Thank you.
In our hearts. You're welcome.
Right, so now I have to say something that makes it worth 3 people having been stuck in a car for 5 hours. No pressure. So thank you, Jo. What's on the agenda about me is actually no longer correct. I was with the small university, California Institute of Clinical Studies as their provost. Not sure how that happened for a few years, and I'm still doing some work with them, but we established this position of executive director half-time for the Alliance. It's been a long-held goal to how can we formalize this work a bit? How can we interface more broadly with our schools, with policymakers, with other educators, and how can we continue to build bridges between independent and public Waldorf education? Because we all know there are a few lumps in the rug there, right? And just as a little bit of a sense, those of you who I don't know, I have indeed been around Waldorf education for a really long time, longer than I care to admit, except let's just say that my son, I came in, as many of us do as a parent, looking for something for my child, and that child is 42, so you can do the math. It's been a while. So, and I was one of those really annoying parents. I walked into the Rudolph Steiner School in the middle of New York City as a brand new arrival with a 5-year-old who immediately became very happy. And the days wore on. We were living in a weird hotel. Who knew it was hard to get accommodation at an apartment in New York City in the mid-80s. And he would come home, we'd go through Central Park, and he would be singing these songs and happy, and I'd be going, what have I walked into? What is this? And so I feel, I will say, I think to my credit, that most of my questions were why questions. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why is that there? Why? And I think in self-defense, they eventually said, come on in. And so that was the beginning of it for me. I was a class teacher for a while there. I was a class teacher in Sacramento, so I had the privilege of taking a class 1 through 8, and then didn't get 7th, 8th grade quite right, so I did that again, and then got pulled into administration. I got interested in the public work, and I'm very mindful that we have public and independent here, very early in its inception, really out of this question of what is Waldorf education, why is it here, and what is its mission? And I am enormously grateful for the many years I spent in independent Waldorf education. It changed who I am. It changed how I think. My children are both, as they are sometimes called, lifers. and I've watched the good and the not good, and I want to be clear about that and that experience, but with enormous gratitude for both. I am now a grandparent of 5. Amazing how young you can have grandchildren, right? And the younger ones are in 3 different Waldorf schools. So I have a grandchild in a very established independent Waldorf school, a grandchild in a very established charter school, and a grandchild in the nursery program of an established independent school. So I am also now, through this really slightly more detached lens, looking at and continuing to ask this question: what is Waldorf education? You would think I would know by now, right? But I think the questions are important. I also think the conditions in Arizona are really interesting and important. So when Joan asked if I would come for today, I jumped at it, and I've been lucky enough to visit 4 schools, and I am very aware that a quick dip into 4 schools does not an expert make, right? And yet it's interesting what impressions you can get, what questions come up, and what observations just from these quick visits. So I'm struck by a number of things from that experience, from listening to all of you today, and just the general picture. I think in Arizona, I'll do a little bit of Arizona exceptionalism for a moment, okay? Even though I come from California, I'll cede you a little bit of ground. You've got some very interesting things. You actually have an earlier teacher preparation program. You have this, you have ACWE, which has brought people together over a long period of time, which I think predates, and I'll get back to this, I think it predates the tension that arose around who is Waldorf and who is not. The tension between public-private, which we have made a lot of progress with, but it's still a tension. So I think you've got a common ground that goes back that includes both. You have this really interesting, it is fascinating. I mean, I've been here, where have I been? Flagstaff, Sedona, Cornwall, I didn't make it to you, and then out to Prescott. And just this question of local education, locale, place, the impact of place, the need to respond to place. You've got a very, very rich set of conditions that automatically mean there's no one definition of Waldorf education. There cannot be in this state. You don't have district schools. All your publics are charter. So I also want to be really clear when we talk about public Waldorf education, it does not say equals charter. And I hear a couple of things there. One is that somehow charters are not public schools. And I think we've gotten into a certain amount of mess with that because we're different. Well, guess what? Frank is absolutely correct. If you're not compliant, you'll go out of business. In today's culture, where people are watching and we are risk averse and quick to react, especially when our children are involved, as public entities, we have different requirements than the privates. And we just have to be really clear about that. It's not a bad thing. It's a statement of fact. So if you're, and so Arizona itself, I think there is a potential here for a real leadership role for this movement called Waldorf education. And I'll get back to that a little bit. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to go way, way back to the beginning. And Michelle, you've referred to it several times already. I think, for all of your schools, I think one of the really important things to do, if you haven't done it already, is to understand founding, founders, and biography. If I work with a school in any significant way, I always do that work with them. Why was this school started? What was the goal? Who was the intended audience? Was it not that there's anything wrong with this, so it's not a judgment statement. Was it just a school for the children of the founders? Because that's often what kicks them into life. Or was it a bigger picture? Because just the children of the founders, that's self-limiting, right? They graduate, if you do your job well. What's the mission? Is it still current? What was that longer range vision? Is it still current? How do we relate to where we are? Do we? Or are we doing, one of the difficulties we got into, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping around a little bit, early in public Waldorf education was what some of us now call the missionary approach, where we came in with this, I think we would all agree here, Waldorf has a lot to offer children in education. But we came in, you know, we're all Miss writing in, here is our gift for you. And actually a school really has to come like that. You've got to do the groundwork with the community. So there was a certain amount of imposing to start with, and it doesn't work, right? A school is of a time and a place. But so let's go back. What is Waldorf education? And go back to that original impulse in 1919, you know, our great plans to celebrate the centennial got blown out of the water in the end because we had to cancel all sorts of things because of COVID. But what were the conditions? Steiner did not come in and say, I have the best education in the world for you, take it. He started working on his theory of education in 1906. He was involved in education before that, but it was not until the question came, can you help us with this, that it became an educational movement. And you know, you probably all know the history, but I do find it delightfully ironic that you know, we pride ourselves on our sort of organic nature. We're sometimes known as the hippie schools. I think that's unfortunate, by the way. But we have this kind of, you know, natural, I love the irony that we started in a cigarette factory. I love the fact that the other best known aspect of Steiner's work is biodynamics, and the leader there is wine. So, you know, what's woven through this? Cigarettes and alcohol. And I think we have to kind of ground ourselves with some of that. But he was asked, of course, most of us know the story, by Emil Molt, the factory owner, to come and work with the workers.
But you know the package had purple on it, you know that, right?
Oh, perfect. We're good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I had one. I don't know where it went, and I don't know why I let it out of my sight, but I had one, and it said Waldorf Astoria, and it had the purple background of the books.
So we're all good. We're faithful to that origin story, right? We've got a lot of purple in this movement, so we're good. So the workers, you know, and I want to paint just a little bit of picture again, with apologies if I'm repeating myself. 1919 Stuttgart, a nation that never expected to lose a war, that has been brought to its knees by a prolonged period of war, where there is economic, political, and social chaos, rioting political factions on the streets, the rise of communism, what was going to become the beginnings of the Nazi Party, etc., competing, prolonged malnutrition in poor children because of the war. So the children the school started with were not wealthy children. They were malnourished and had very little. And we often forget a pandemic, right? We might be able to see one or two parallels to our contemporary culture, context. It was a time of human crisis, yeah? It was, and the stakes were very high. And so the workers said, well, actually, we appreciate you coming, and this, I'm sure this isn't quite how they put it, but what we'd really like you to do is to develop an education for our children. They have their eye on the future, as parents tend to do, right? And so the school began, you know, we talked about teacher preparation, 2 weeks of preparation, and they were up and running. They had certain advantages with that. If you see pictures of the first class, there are huge numbers of children in the class. But this was a social, to put it in contemporary language, this was a social justice endeavor, right? Its goal, as Steiner put it, was if we want to change the future, we need a different art of education for the children, one that is based on a true knowledge of the human being. And that true knowledge of the human being, of course, was a very comprehensive picture that includes the spirit, right? And into that he put a lot of, at that time, revolutionary methods. And he often referred to Waldorf education as a method. In fact. And what he did not intend to do, as far as I can tell from what I have read, is to, in fact, in the Roots of Education, because I haven't marked, which is one of his very late lecture cycles, he actually says it was not the intention to start an anthroposophical school movement. We will need some of those schools, basically in order to really continue to deepen, refine, and explore this approach. But what we really want to do is to be able to enkindle in any teacher in any setting the ability to work out of this true nature of the human being, right? So at the end of the day, I know from my own experience, from the years I taught, at the end of the day, it's who goes into that classroom, what picture and knowledge they are bringing with them, and what they do with those children. That's really boiling it down, but there's a lot of truth to that. So what do we need in order for that to happen well? The other thing I just want to note with this picture, this social justice picture, the goal of the early education, was he also said, and we can lean too heavily into this, but I think we need to acknowledge it, there will be compromises. We need to make compromises in order for this education to be here. Obviously, we need to be mindful of the compromises we make, and we need to have enough of a sense of what this is when we reach, the Martin Luther moment, known by many 7th graders. This I cannot do. But there aren't many of those, right? So all of you here, the majority of you who are engaged in this enterprise called public education, know this very well. We make the compromises that are required. We must be accountable. We are funded, and we are funded in our independent schools as well, and those compromises show up there as well, for sure. But we need to understand how we keep the base intact so that we don't get hung up around the periphery with this idea, again, referring back to Michelle, of sacred nothings. One of the challenges of Waldorf education, from my point of view, is that we have created a shell that is not flexible, right? And I think our challenge now is how we breathe life into this living being of Waldorf education coming out of this living being of anthroposophia, the being of anthroposophy, which is the knowledge of the human being. How do we keep it flexible? And I will tell you, it's not. I mean, I'll say that very simply. It's the sacred nothings. It's the simplistic definitions of, if I had have taken $1 at the door of my office for every time I had often a parent, sometimes a teacher tell me what was and was not Waldorf, I could actually retire. Especially if I got 10 cents for every chair I moved over all those years. But we have behaviors and mannerisms and a curriculum, I'm going to get to that one, and methods, And many of them are built out of this knowledge of the human being. They are profoundly wise pedagogically. And some of them are complete nonsense. And they're all mixed up in this brew that we call Waldorf education, right? So there is a lot of work going on right now. There was a lot of work done in the UK through the pandemic because their schools got into some significant difficulty because they were, one, not compliant, and two, things had sort of gotten too contained and not alive. So they've done this wonderful, huge amount of work. We're trying to figure out, it's one of the Cross ASNA Alliance weekend, no, not weekend, because it's not early childhood yet, projects. What is this? And is it useful? Would it help us? Or would it become one more tendency towards rigidifying? But what they did, one of the things they did was, I think, very helpful. It is not new. It has been done. You look at countries like Australia and New Zealand, no bias, but who have had to do this work because everything's upside down and inside out. So at a certain point you have to confront, so why are we eating, I'm just going to give one example from my own childhood, why are we exchanging Christmas cards with snow? And why are we eating a hot Christmas dinner in the middle of the day, then going to the beach and feeling like we're going to drown? How do you work with the living substance where you are? And so what they have identified that I think is helpful is they say, you've got to start from the principles. Thank you for putting the principles on your brochure. It's much appreciated.
Got to start from where?
The core principles. And there are different ways of expressing those. So the Pedagogical Section Council in North America developed a set of principles for Waldorf education for North America because ASNA and the Alliance, public and private, were not managing their relationship very well. So let's find out where our common basic ground is. This project puts it up here, they call it the meso level. I actually suspect it's down here as the foundation. Doesn't really matter. So, and included in that is the actual picture of the human being. And every educational system has a picture of the human being. Every educational system is designed for humans, no matter how much we might try to pretend that's not what we're doing. So here we have this really comprehensive, beautiful, big picture of the human being. It's, it's holistic and integrated on steroids, right? It's very comprehensive. The evolution of consciousness, the different bodies, the cycle through life, etc. It's big. Then there is this picture of child development. And if we are working from the why, ideally we can give a developmental answer to everything we are doing in a school. Now again, we know that we live in real time, in real places, with real constraints. But we want to be able to relate what we're doing back to what is appropriate for the development of the child. And if we have to move that around because of assessment requirements or benchmarks or whatever, we want to know that that's what we're doing and why. It's okay. It really is. It's okay. But we want to know why. We want to know what would be ideal, and none of us are doing the ideal. I'm sorry, not one. I haven't found that ideal Waldorf school yet. Then we have this question of the purpose of education. In the Alliance, we talk strongly about the social justice perspective, the access question. And we have our role as the adults. It's not just the children who are developing. We don't get to stop. There's no sort of done human being until the very end of life. And then depending on what you believe, that's just a beginning, right? So that as a community, we are a learning community in the very best sense of the word, that we are all engaged in continuing to build our understanding of this work, of the picture of the human being, of what is around us, of the challenges and opportunities of our time, with an eye on the fact that we are working into the future. Education is now, but it's into the future. Many of the forms of education, the structures, are very historical. So we're at a tension point, right? So these principles, then they said, then we've got this, what they call the meso level, M-E-S-O, the middle level, and that is more to do with, for example, a country or a continent, externals, requirements on you, etc. And then you go down to the micro level, which is a school in a place with a class, with a teacher, with a group of students, with particular knowledge, experience, funds of knowledge is what it's often called. And so the education here can be very justifiably different, actually even within a school, from the education in a class, although you want some standardization in a school or we'll all go nuts. But traveling even in this state, I mean, the change in geography, in elevation, in quality of light is quite extraordinary, and I haven't even ventured south yet. You would expect to see that reflected in the schools, right? Yeah? And so this, what was the old phrase? Think globally, act locally. Mm-hmm. I think we can apply that to Waldorf education, that there's this global picture that we're drawing from. There are a whole bunch of methods and methodologies that have been developed in over 100 years. We don't want to throw all of those out because there's lots of evidence that they are well based in research. You know, we can tie a lot of what we do to research, which we need to be able to do for our authorizers or our parents or our boards or whatever. There's good reason why we do these things. We're not just, you know, wasting the children's days. We get results. There's good reason for the speed we go at. We need to be well versed in all of this. But there's a lot of our requirement there to localize, to take those methods, those methodologies, the materials, you know, and I think, I don't quite know why, you might have thought about this more. I think we wanted, you know, most of us when we encounter Waldorf education, we fall in love, right? It's beautiful, it feels good. I wish I'd had that you can't say that, but I wish I'd had that education as a child. I wonder what that would have been like, and that's all true. But then we can take a step. This is not at all what I intended to talk about, by the way. Just so you know. Then we can take a step and say, well, it has to be this, and it must be this, and you must use these materials, and you can't have these colors, or you must have these colors, and etc., etc. And that becomes the shell. And there's no room to breathe, right? So I either step fully into the shell, don't bother me, or we've seen this with teachers and parents, I come up against the shell, I try to figure out how to penetrate it, and then I bounce off mad. Sound familiar at all? Yeah? So part of our task as we look at this shell, this, you know, 103-year-old shell this September, is that math right? Mm-hmm. Is how do we tend it? How do we keep it flexible? How do we give it more of the character of a cocoon or a chrysalis in which these young people can grow and learn and thrive and truly be set free? And how do we watch ourselves with our desire to fix it in place and time, right? So we have had, and interestingly, as I've, you know, as I said, I can't make any assumptions from brief visits to 4 schools, but hey, what the heck. I've heard very little compared to if I were going to California schools in Arizona about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. It doesn't mean it's not here, but it does not appear to be here in the sense that it really blew some schools up. Maybe you're all just through it. I don't have enough history to know that. But this is a part of our work now, that this shell, this you know, it was a beautiful shell, had a very particular worldview. That was very particular worldview that was unchallenged. I mean, I think back, I taught in New York and Sacramento, and I think back to some of the things that I just took as, that's how you do it. I might last 3 weeks under today's conditions with my unchallenged assumptions and my enactment of a worldview, and I fault myself completely because I grew up on the other side of the world, but my worldview that was completely Middle Europe centric, that was really continuing this lineage of curriculum from when it was first written down by Carolina von Heidebrandt, who said this is what we did at the first school, that then got modernized with Stockmeyer, then got modernized again, and then, alleluia, how many of you have the yellow book in your faculty library? Come on, fess up.
Yeah, we need that.
You need it. You know, when Martin Rawson and Evelson updated it, and when was it? I think it was just as I was coming out of the classroom. It was like, darn, that would have been really helpful. Where they did the horizontal and the vertical curriculum and linked it to child development, etc., etc. We all went, here it is. Here's the curriculum. Yeah? And Martin himself will say, just as I'm sure von Heidebrandt and others would have said, that was not the intention. That was a representation of what was being done in England at that time. But because the task is so vast, we need help. I needed help. Tell me what to do. Tell me what needs to be done at this point. Uh-oh, I think we've just got another purchaser for the yellow book. But wait, there's a new version.
Yeah, but then that's like the wheel. It doesn't have to be reinvented. It can just be
exactly.
You know, better tires, or better material, or whatever. You know,
Totally.
We don't have to always reinvent. I go back to those discussions where it's like, oh.
And we don't have to throw it all out.
Yeah.
But we do need to be asking, as a collegial group, where are the sticking points? Where does this not feel aligned with who this school is? Are we representing a broader community? Even if our community is very homogeneous, are we representing for these citizens of the world a broader view of that world? Are we honoring and respecting our local history and knowledge? Does it show up? Not in tokenism, but does it show up? And are we curious? And then we do all of that with our wonderful pedagogical approaches and our arts and our music and our movement and our drama and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we continue, I agree, that would be utterly exhausting. I have no interest in that enterprise. But you have this amazing lab here, I think. You know, I know that some of you drove for a very long time to get here, longer than you possibly planned. But almost everyone had to drive to get here. That's a commitment. But can you do an information exchange? Can you begin, I would help you in a heartbeat, with a sort of a curriculum project, maybe tied with the teacher education, that said, you know, I was talking to a teacher in Oregon a couple of weeks ago, and she said, you know, I'm going into 3rd grade, and this is often the classic example. I am really uncomfortable with the curriculum of the Hebrew stories. I said, okay. And she said, and I went back to a week training back east this summer, and they said it's really the only body of stories that will meet the developmental needs of the third grader. Okay, what are the developmental needs of the third grader? What are we addressing here? Let's look at them. Because what some schools did with this discomfort is they said, well, we'll just give them creation stories all year. Problem with that is they never land on the earth. And that's the goal of this developmental stage, that we're coming out of here to here, and we've got to figure out what to do. So what are the parallels? Well, one that a lot of schools are starting to discover is the Hopi, where there are a lot of parallels. And maybe you do some of this, and you substitute something else. But this question, and to ask a teacher to step into a classroom and teach something that they feel totally uncomfortable teaching, you're going to have however many children in that class going, I smell phony.
Yeah, right.
Because that's what they do. So what's the intent? Do we understand the developmental sequence? Do we understand the developmental indications? Do we understand that, ideally we would do it this way, but because of a requirement we need to do, early kindergarten is the perfect example. Ideally we wouldn't do academics in kindergarten. Guess what, folks? Got it? So how do we do them developmentally? How do we do least harm in what we're doing? Because I've been a teacher and a parent. I did harm. It's such an intimate relationship. So how do I minimize that? How do I keep it alive? And that's where I think you have this amazing resource of these schools, and you have some really interesting sort of private-public histories, and weaving between, and schools that have morphed from one to the other, or come out of, as was described, the ashes of one to another. You've got this very interesting situation here, which I would really encourage you to, I don't want to add one more thing for you to do, but to celebrate and to figure out how to have some of these dialogues about, well, we're doing this, what are you doing? And, oh, that's an interesting idea. It's like the walking to get the butter, Oh, I never thought of that. And we are trying to figure out through this project how we can build a repository so we can share the brilliance that's happening in classrooms, and that we don't have to keep reinventing it.
And also the thought about, if it was in the original curriculum, there's a reason for that. If you just decide, okay, because Steiner talks about Waldorf education as an organism, or Waldorf schools as organisms.
Yep.
So you just throw out something, it's like, okay, so now I don't have an appendix anymore. I don't need my appendix. As far as a lot of people live without an appendix, but then why did we have an appendix in the first place?
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
I would say what he actually said, this was what was developed for that school at that time. And again, I think we have to come back to the, Norse mythology is a huge topic of conversation right now. Should schools in China and India and Africa be learning about all of these blonde, blue-eyed gods and goddesses, etc., etc.? If you take apart the elements of Norse mythology and ask, why this one? Then you can appropriately answer the question about, I personally love Norse mythology for the fourth graders. I think it just hits them exactly where they're living, exactly. Who wouldn't love something that starts out of an armpit if you're a fourth grader, and goes from there? But in order to be able to not just be reactive and throw it out, we have to be able to say why. Why? And when we are beginning, that's too much. So we do need, tell me what to do. And that can be both as a school or an individual teacher. But as we develop, I think that questioning becomes more important. And that then brings us around to these questions of teacher preparation, ongoing professional development, and collegiality, which I will hopefully wrap this up with, and then I'll look and say, oh, that's what I was going to talk about. Just want to tell you I did my prep. Every school I go to, every conversation I have, we are coming back to the crisis in teaching. Right? We are a microcosm of a macrocosm. We are not different. We got a bunch of older teachers who are saying after the last 2 or 3 years, I'm done. I'm done, I'm retiring. We have a slightly thinner next generation coming behind in terms of teaching demographics. And then we have younger people, thank goodness, who have come with different expectations, different requests for working conditions, different requests around clarity. This is all good. The problem, and that has accelerated, we have not yet figured out what the pandemic, I mean, we know we've got dysregulated kids, we know that we've got stretched teachers still, we know that we haven't settled in yet, and I think this is a sort of recover and rebuild year for all of us in education. But we haven't yet figured out what the change in expectations around work is going to mean in schools, right?
For the teachers or for
everybody? Parents' expectations, teachers, how we teach, how and where we live.
Are you thinking about homework as well? I mean,
there are some sea
what
changes.
We ask of the students, I mean, because that's also like, that's changed too, like what do we think about that?
Well, if we're, a couple of observations, and I really am mindful we've got 2 reports and we're all really hungry. If we're pulling out a substantial portion of our children for special services, we're going to have to change what we're doing in the classroom.
Exactly.
Right? Because you can't pull out half your class. You can't provide services in that way. So, and your schools, I heard it with the 4 I've been to, are attracting children because of the observation that this is a place of respect and hope and healing, right? Waldorf is a healing education. But where's that tipping point where we actually have to change the classroom rather than try and fix the children to fit in the classroom, right? That works when you've got a couple of kids that you're pulling out and providing services for. Does it work when you've got a third of them? I don't have an answer, I just have questions. So that's one. We don't know yet, but what I do know is that, and I'm hearing a lot more parent activity here than I expected. Waldorf schools traditionally were built on the idea that the community would carry the school and the teachers wouldn't get paid much. I mean, just to strip it all down. The parents are not showing up in the way they used to. Is it temporary? I don't think so, because it's way pre-COVID. So again, are we changing the model of how we're managing a school to accept that reality, or are we mad at them because they're not showing up? And what does that mean if we shift that and say, that's not going to happen, so how do we get these very real needs in the school met? And there is health in all of this. I promise, there's growth. We just have to wrestle. And then just as a closing thought, I'm going to make a plea, and it's mine, but I'm not alone. I personally do not like the term teacher training. I personally do not like the term teacher training because I'm unconvinced you can train a teacher. I don't have a good substitute. I'm using teacher education, but it's a mouthful. But what have you got here, and how could you develop it? And again, I've heard lots of talk about credentialing and certification and national and local, and I think we have to have a bit of a reality check about where things stand. There is no national certification of a Waldorf teacher. It doesn't exist. There are institutions that are OSNA members. They're not credentialed by OSNA, they are OSNA members, and that is commonly understood to be a sort of a standard of, I almost said training, preparation. Here you are developing something. What I'm seeing is there's a big tendency towards grow your own. Schools are saying we can't take the time, money, or distance to go to the existing offerings, so we're going to do it on the ground on our own. You're a step up from that. You've got a state. You've got an established organization. You've got a history of having this happen here. You've got a well-designed, I've had a look at it, sequence of courses, etc. Could you take that idea of local and say that within this, we're all going to take a really hard look at it and decide whether it works for our school? It's already now become an ACWE training, an ACWE endorsed program. Could you, and I'm projecting out, could you all as member schools say we are going to accept this within the state as a qualification? So then, and then, you know, there's a separate conversation, I think, with the Alliance as to what's possible. We're not accreditors. We don't accredit schools. We don't accredit adult education. We're an alliance of members, 63 and growing. I think that was my topic. It would start to, I think it would start to ripple out from there as a model. And that, because you have a good number of schools here, is a really substantial starting point. So for each school to ask, what do I need to know about this in order to say I will give it equivalency? Where's my discomfort or my comfort, because I've heard both. What do I need to see in order to step into this? Then you've got, and then you all have to say, and I will offer a job to anyone with that certification. Then you've got a state basis as a model that I think is really interesting, because you've already got the organization and the history. Yeah.
And you're saying the model means that if we would be that beacon for, let's say, the United States, then other states would also create sort of an ACWE, only it would be not ACWE, but it would be CQUE or whatever.
I don't know. I don't know whether this then becomes something with that is a center beyond the state. I see that as being entirely possible.
Okay.
Because it's accessible. You just don't have to not mind being hot. But it's accessible and relatively inexpensive to come here.
Okay.
And,
okay.
So that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Or it is replicated in different ways, but
Right.
but you know, I think there's some conversation, I suspect with my listening ears, there are some conversations that have not yet happened that need to happen around what are our reservations as a school? What do we need to see? About what?
The program.
I've created a problem. I have a problem. I mean, it's my problem, and I don't have a good alternative
But
word.
it keeps us conscious when we think about that. I think that's really actually a good idea.
You know, if I went around every school right now and said, would you, right now, just picking a few of you, and you're brand new, so you can just say no, would you accept a teacher candidate who is either enrolled in this program, and I keep pointing to you, I'm sorry, Michelle, or has come to us as a qualified, I missed the word trained, as a qualified Waldorf teacher, public or independent. And it may be that that's the conversation that has to happen, and people have to be willing to say, here are my reservations, or here is what I'm seeing is really positive.
Here are my reservations.
Or here's what I'm seeing that is really positive. So that you build a consensus, and maybe it's not every school, but you build a consensus where you say, we are really aware of this, we really support it, we feel we can have, we can give feedback if needed. We are willing, I don't know whether you're going to get to placements for people who aren't yet in a school, or whether they all have to be in a school, but we're willing to take people in for observation or placement or whatever. And at the end, we will say this is a qualified teacher, and we are willing to hire them or to give them the pay raise or whatever that comes with qualification. I think that might be an important next step, just from what I've heard. And you know, again, I would say with all love and respect, if there are no resources in a school to provide any sort of professional development or teacher education, you're not ready. I mean, I'm just gonna say it that bluntly. And I know there's the trick that you've got to get started before you get the money coming in as your startup grant, but you've got to be looking, or as you said, it will implode.
It can happen in meetings. I've watched it in other private schools. Circle of Seasons in Pennsylvania, the only charter Waldorf school that ever existed in that state, still does, started with 2 kindergartens, 2 first, 2 second, 2 third, and 1 fourth the first year. And all those teachers are untrained. There's no way that Phil was gonna get that many teachers in there. And Eugene Schwartz knows it because he was their first mentor and I was their second mentor. And it's hard. It's hard, but you've gotta find, what you said is, just think about it, 50 states, we start out 50 different ways and take just an average of about 100 districts within the state. That's 5,000 different ways of doing something. We still have to keep up a standard within Waldorf, but we have to fit within those 5,000 sectors. How do we do that? That means our neighbor down the street, this neighbor that's right at the corner, we know nothing about that school, I bet you. I bet you no one on this campus knows anything about what they teach, what grade level, and is there a connection? Because sometimes we're insular, in my personal opinion, I get to say this 33 years, we are insular into Waldorf and not looking beyond that.
It's really hard to look through a shell. Yeah. And at the end of the course for the first teachers, we have to be people of initiative, we have to be interested in the world around us, and we have to be honest. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, sitting here though and listening, I felt what I heard was lots of, we hooked up with these people and these people, and so I see an actual reaching out.
Totally.
Partnership.
Totally.
For that.
Yep.
And, there's schools especially, and everybody.
Absolutely.
Almost from everybody, but they're reaching out and doing other things.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, since I raised my hand, sometimes some of the things we're throwing away or that we're evolving out of or whatever is actually hurting us. And so if there isn't parent-child classes or home visits, different things that encourage the parents to be a part of the school and parent education and community education. And I'm not saying I'm just saying my experience not having those things has hurt
Absolutely. And we must stop. I would also say that if I look at the growth of the public school movement from 1991 on, I observe a few things. One, our schools over time tend to gentrify, right? There's some important information for us there. Two, we took of necessity a lot of independent school culture and parked it in a public school setting without the necessary analysis. And so that doesn't mean you throw everything out. It means that you are really doing that hard work of consciousness. So I am not a throw everything out person at all. I think children need the embrace of a lot of our practices, more now than ever before. But you can't, I've been working with one school, you can't just say, well, we're just going to do this independent work in a public setting and pretend it's independent. You can't do that, and yet you can't give up the purpose of what you're doing. So I think there are all of these really interesting points of tension. Freedom, compliance, independence, public, historical, current. There's a whole bunch of them. Now, if we think of tension, there's a creative possibility, right? But we got to keep our eye on it or it hits us in the face. Yeah? So I think this is our work, and what I would say is, one, thank you for allowing me to mouth off for a while, based on very little time here. I think, exactly for what you're saying, I think you have a contained, not a shell, but a contained, really interesting opportunity in this state because of the history of ACWE, because the long existence of ACWE, because there was an early teacher education program, because there's always been collaboration between public and private. It's had rough moments, but there's always been collaboration. And because if you go from one end of the state to the other, you encounter very different conditions that impact schools. So you've got it all, you know, I come from California, it's 800 miles one end to the other. This is big, but it's not impossible to do, and now we have Zoom, you know, we need, I don't know whether you're gonna develop it, but we need videos of good teachers teaching that our young teachers can look at. What is a main lesson? Nothing like watching one. I might not be able to go, but I can, because we broke down that one because we had to with the pandemic. There's a gift. There were a few, not many, but a few. So, like within the state, you are doing all of these things, and what I'm saying is go, do it even more, and have the conversations that are needed to take next steps together. Not that everyone has to do the same thing, but that allow you to build on that in a really vibrant way. And then we'll all come flocking, because you'll fix it for us. So I don't know whether that's helpful or unhelpful, but thank you for allowing me to be here and to just be with you. And yes, there's a lot of really wonderful work going on here and a lot of really important questions being asked. Let's keep our eye on the why. Yeah. And I said this at your school, Pine Forest. You know, this interesting fact that a 2017 research project, it must be real because it's a research project, said that 2/3 of the children entering first grade in 2017 would be doing a job that hasn't yet been invented, with skills that we haven't yet discovered.
Say that again.
2/3 of the children entering first grade in 2017 would be doing a job with skills that have not yet been invented, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that. Now that was 2017, we've had the pandemic. It's gone way up.
Mm-hmm.
So we know about potentiality of the human being. We know about developing capacities. We know about soft skills. We know about social emotional. We need to get loud, I think. And a collective voice is louder on behalf of these children who are going into the future in a system that wants to keep it all locked down.
Yeah, I mean, thinking in the box, you know, testing, all those things. I mean, it's like we're trying to lock everything down. And the soft skills that means that we have general skills, right? Because I don't even know that concept, but
it's like
I guess that means that
human skills,
that I
creativity,
can
imagination.
diversify from there,
Yeah.
right? Okay, or specify.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Perfect.
do it. Congratulations to all of you. Thank you for the work you're doing.